Tonight, we're going to dive into Daniel chapter 8. But before we do, there is a verse that I want to read that kind of skips ahead past what I'm going to be speaking on. But it kind of gives it. You ever watch a movie and you always wonder, man, how do they do that? Anyone here like to watch behind the scenes of how they make movies and stuff? It's just watching all that goes into making a movie, and you're like, they just make it look so easy, right? But I mean, you can't discount or discredit like talent and skill, right? I mean, these people making movies and doing things, they're very talented. They're very skilled at what they do. And I think about the Bible, and I think about a guy like Daniel. I'm like, man, how does he do it? You know, here we have a guy that, yes, you know, he went through quite a bit to get where he is today. And God has given him so much, right? He has so much wisdom, so much foresight, so much insight, so much knowledge. God has given him so much. And he's able to interpret these dreams. And these are wild dreams. And so I always wonder, man, something's got to give at some point, right? And then we have Daniel chapter 8. And I love this. I love this because it shows that Daniel is human. I think all too often in the Bible, we look at people that God uses and go, well, that's it. I mean, this is superhuman. This person is not a mere mortal like you and I. So, of course, God's going to use someone like, Gideon, who, he might have been like the least of the least, but like he led such a small army against such a vast army. Like, that's not real. That's a movie script, right? And so we'll look at some of these situations and be like, okay, man, these people aren't real. I can't relate to that. Well, let me give you a passage that you can relate to. Daniel chapter 8. And he goes in, we're starting in verse 15. While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it. I want you to catch that real quick. He was watching the vision and trying to understand it. Right? Because what we're about to dive into is absolutely wild. And here is Daniel, who was able to interpret, who was able to tell the kings what their dreams were, who was able to foresee and tell what was going to happen, and the writing on the wall. All these things have happened, and now he's sitting here trying to understand this vision that's being told to him. Verse 17, so when he approached, I was standing, and when he came near, I was terrified and fell face down. Son of man, he said to me, understand that the vision refers to the end of time. Verse 18, while he was speaking, I fell into a deep sleep. I don't know about you, I got a little chuckle out of that because sometimes there's situations and things that I come into that are just so much that I'm just like, I'm out. I just follow, I'm done. But here's, I say that kind of jokingly, but to say this is, I think sometimes when we look at a book like Daniel, we think there's no way that happened. This is too much for a simple man. But what's great about this is it shows that Daniel was merely just a man like you and I. But it also shows that the glory doesn't go to the man, the glory goes to God. Because any mystery that we face in the Bible, we all have no business doing anything else but falling down and like falling asleep because we don't get it. But it's because of the glory of God. We want to bring him glory through all things. So if we are receiving the glory, if we're receiving the accolade, if we're receiving the well-to-do, we're doing it wrong because the focus isn't on us, it's on him. So before we jumped into Daniel chapter 8, I just wanted to kind of give you a little of that. Because as things get crazy, I want us to remember that no matter what happens when we go through this, when we seek understanding of the word of the Lord, it's to be used to bring glory to him and not to further ourselves. So let's jump into Daniel chapter 8. We're going to start in verse 1. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that had appeared to me earlier. I saw the vision, and as I watched, I was in the fortress city of Susa in the province of Elam. I saw the vision that I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there was a ram standing beside the canal. He had 2 horns. These 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, and the longer one came up last. I saw the ram charging to the west, the north, and the south, and no animal could stand against him. There was no rescue from his power. He did whatever he wanted and became great. Verse 5, as I was observing, a male goat appeared, coming from the west across the surface of the entire earth without touching the ground. The goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and rushed at him with savage fury. I saw him approaching the ram and infuriated him. He struck the ram, breaking his 2 horns, and the ram was not strong enough to stand against him. The goat threw him to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat acted even more arrogantly. But when he became powerful, the large horn was broken. 4 conspicuous horns came up in its place, pointing towards the 4 winds of heaven. So when we look at these dreams, and we see these visions that are happening, and there's always the bigger picture of what's happening in the world around. So when we think about this vision, we think about in reference to the earlier vision that Nebuchadnezzar had in chapter 3, when we're talking about the big giant statue that was erected with multiple different types of materials, and he was confused as to what was going on. But what we see here is a focus on 4 different governments, right? So today's message is really going to be kind of a history touch-up. All right, because the weird stuff comes later, but we need to get the history out of the way first. So we see that this is a reference to 4 governments, and this is, again, referencing the statue. We see Babylon, which in the statue was referred to by the head. We have the Medes, the Medo-Persian Empire, and that's the arms and the breast of silver. The Greek Empire was shown here by the belly of brass, and then Rome was showed in the legs and the feet of iron. And so as we look at this statue, and obviously there's a lot of socio-political action happening, there's a lot of fighting, there's a lot of empires rising and empires falling, we see that we're focusing on 2 governments here. We're looking at the Medo-Persians and the Greeks. Why? Why are we focusing on these 2? Well, what we see in this and during this time, and this is actually a chapter of prophecy. So a lot of what was happening was kind of an immediate prophecy to the kings of the Persians, right, or the kings of the Medes, and we're seeing, and even Babylon itself, we're seeing some kind of really close timeline action happening, whether it's talking about King Nebuchadnezzar, whether we're talking King Darius, whether we're talking about Belshazzar. There was a lot of short term, but now what we're seeing is we're seeing the shift into a long-term prophetic or a long-term prophecy that God is going to be fulfilling over what would actually end up being hundreds of years. So a couple of key points in this time is that King Cyrus of the Persians, they gave permission to the Jews to go back and rebuild their city. So we're seeing a lot of focus on what God is doing through these quote-unquote enemies of the people, but how God is using these enemies, how God is using these other foreign countries to impact his people and also the lineage further down the line of his people. Cyrus is the one that gave the people permission to go back and rebuild the city. We see that in Ezra chapter 1, where we see Jeshua and Zerubbabel come back, and they're the ones leading the charge to rebuild the city. So the Persians are playing this big role in God's rebuilding of his people. But we also see that the Greeks come into play, as they're the ones who actually created the language that is used to write the New Testament. Right, so God's hand is in, even in this time, which is hundreds of years before we even think about the New Testament. God is starting to paint the picture of how he is going to use others to impact his people. And so when we look at these two animals, we have the ram and we have the goat, we see conflict that comes about. So let's look at the ram first. So we're introduced to this ram in chapter 8, verse 3. It says, he looked up, I see a ram standing, had two horns, and one horn was longer than the other, but the longer came up last. So the ram here is representing the Medes and the Persians. All right, if you were to look at a map, you would see that they came across and that they charged and they took hold of everything to the west, to the north, and the south of them. Their empires spread across the west and conquered, we see that they conquered Babylon, first off, in 539 BC. They conquered Egypt soon after in 525 BC. And it said that no animal could stand against his power. When we think about this idea that no one can stand against, we have this concept of arrogance. And we have a magnifying of self. Is that not a theme that we've seen even throughout in the book of Daniel? King Nebuchadnezzar, how did he show his arrogance and power? Well, let's make a nice statue for ourselves that everybody can bow down to. See, the idea is that man on their own isn't enough. And so pride and arrogance come into play. And we see that idea of pride and arrogance come time and time again in the Bible as a root sin that multiplies others' sin. We think back into Genesis in the garden. Right? When Adam and Eve were told, hey, listen, you can eat of anything in the garden except for the tree in the middle. And then when the serpent comes up and says, hey, listen, did God really say that if you eat of this tree, you will surely die? And Eve goes, yeah. And he goes, no. You won't die. You'll be like God. That's pride. You see, these kings of these nations and these empires, they used power and arrogance to conquer and lead. And see, Satan wants to use power, pride, and arrogance in our lives to draw us away from God, to push us away from the truth. Because if we are prideful, then what does biblical truth actually stand for in our lives? Nothing. Why? Because we want it our way. We want things our way. And so as we see this conquest of the Medes and Persians coming across, and that no one could stand against the power of the ram. And so we see this power struggle that comes into play when we're introduced to the goat in verse 5. Verse 5, it says, I was observing, a male goat appeared, coming from the west across the surface of the entire earth, without touching the ground. The goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. This goat, this conspicuous horn, we see this trending tendency towards Greece. And then obviously from Greece, we see the rise of the power of Alexander the Great. In the year 334 BC, Alexander began and laid siege to the Persians, and he conquered the mighty city of Babylon, right? So we see in verse 6 through 8 this battle, this fury that comes on. He says he saw the two-horned ram coming, but that he said standing beside the canal, and rushed with savage fury. I saw him approaching the ram, and infuriated, he struck the ram, breaking his two horns. And the ram was not strong enough to stand against him. And the goat threw him to the ground and trampled him. And there was no one to rescue the ram from his power. Alexander the Great was thought to believe when he says that the goat traveled without touching the ground. The speed at which Alexander conquered nations was so swift. And you think about the timeline of his whole empire lasted about 13 years. But if you think about what he accomplished, what he conquered in 13 years, it would seem that he wasn't even touching the ground how quickly he would go across and conquer nations. And sometimes we may look at this and go, okay, God, here we have two nations, two people groups, two two sets of arrogant leaders who in their conquest thought of no one but themselves. How can I raise power for myself? And we see that God uses these people groups in mighty, mighty ways. Even someone like Alexander the Great. But something to think about, and this is what I said, this is more of a long-term prophetic. Alexander the Great didn't come into power until 200 years after this prophecy was spoken in Daniel chapter 8. So what does that mean for us? It shows us that God is working in the midst of all the little things. That God is working in the midst of the things that we may look at and say, God, we don't understand why we're going through this. If you think about the Israelite people, you think about the people of God who he had favor upon, yet they were kicked out. They were pushed out. They were conquered out of their land. They were taken up in this great exile. And yet, even in the midst of that, God was using these world powers to start setting things in motion for his will to be done. I think of the story of Joseph and how when Joseph started, it started with visions. And Joseph, I can imagine Joseph going up to his brothers going, I've got a story for you. And it's so funny because in this story, like, there was this stalk and all the others were bowing down to him. Man, it was crazy. And I'm sure the brothers are sitting there going, But see, what happened was pride and arrogance came into play. The brothers could not stand that there was a plan that God had for Joseph's life. And so when they threw him in the pit, as opposed to killing him, right? When they threw him in the pit, they meant for his life to be over. They meant for his life to be the one that was the slave to the other stalks. But just like in this, when we see in this prophecy that yes, bad things are gonna happen. And what's interesting is a lot of times when people use the phrase, why would God let bad things happen to good people? Well, we see it right here. It's because in God's will, in God's plan, he lets it rain on the just and the unjust. Why? Because his will is going to happen. And sometimes we need to be knocked off of our pedestal. Sometimes we need to be brought down a level or 12 in order for us to see that God has a plan. Because otherwise, on our own, would we willfully follow sometimes where we can't see what God is doing? When it looks rough, when things look bad, sometimes we may sit back and go, okay, God, this is just too much. And Joseph could have given up in his time. I mean, Joseph's life was such a roller coaster. Because here he was sold into slavery, and then yet the favor of God was on him. Why? Because he was faithful and obedient. And so he rose in power, well, then all of a sudden, his boss's wife decided she wanted to make a big deal of it and tried to tempt him. And when he refused, well then, of course, his life took a dive. And he ended up back in prison. But then he came back up because he was able to be faithful. Why? He was faithful and obedient to God. He was able to help and do what he's called to do. And so finally he rises back up into second command. All of this to happen so that one day his brothers would come to him because there's a famine in Egypt. And Joseph's able to look at them and say, look, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. Why? Because his will is going to be done. So when we look at this prophecy, we see this idea that, yes, we have this ram, we have this goat, and then we have this third person who's going to be coming into the story next week. But we see these two world powers combining and colliding. We see this friction. We see this fighting. We see all of these things happen. And sometimes we don't understand. But what we don't understand is that in the midst of all of it, God is working something. So what does he require of us? He requires faithfulness from us. See, in order for us to not get distracted, we must remain focused on Him. I don't know about you guys, but we live in a day and age that is very distracting. Do we not? I mean, I was teaching Bible study this morning, and I had my phone up because I like to keep the timer. And I was distracted because we were talking softball tomorrow night. Sorry, that wasn't a dig, Jerry. I'm excited for tomorrow night at 7:30. But we're distracted. We're super distracted. So it's easy for us to be like Daniel when all of this is happening. And we're sitting here trying to understand, okay, God, I've been faithful. I've been obedient. I do the things you're asking me to do. But yet we sit here and we try to understand, and we come to a place where we just kind of fall asleep, where God has to wake us up. Why? Because we can't be distracted. We must stay focused on what He's calling us to do. And so when we see these world powers combining, we see these world powers colliding, we see fighting and wars and battles, and we see all the societal issues that we're struggling with, we have to stay focused. Otherwise, we will miss what God is working in the midst of what we consider to be bad. There's a piece of each one of these governments, each one of these people groups. There's a piece to the puzzle that God was putting together and placing together for His people. And you know what? It doesn't necessarily get any easier. Because even when you fast forward all the way through, and you fast forward until we've got a baby born in Bethlehem, does it get easy? No, because even when Jesus was walking on the earth, He was persecuted. He dealt with people who just didn't get it. Doesn't that make you feel like you're in good company? And so we look at this vision, we look at what Daniel's seeing, and we see these two animals, and we see these horns and these governments. We see all these different pieces that are being put together. We cannot lose sight of what God is doing. Listen, I do not like to get into politics. I don't care who is voted as president, because at the end of the day, God's will is going to be done. I don't care what left or right or who is uprising. I don't care what world powers around the world are doing to connive against us as a people or even us as Christians. I don't care, because at the end of the day, God's will is going to be done. And if anything else, all this stuff, all the wars and the rumors of wars, all the earthquakes, guess what? That's what the Bible says is going to kind of speed this process up for Jesus to come. And so as we look at these prophecies, we have to remember that God is in the midst of it. We have to get out of our micro view, and we have to take a look at the macro view of what God is doing. It's easy for us to get caught up. It was easy for the Jews to get caught up because they had been stripped away from everything that they had known, wondering, God, where are you? And so I want to encourage us tonight that even when you are facing times of confusion and questioning, and sometimes when the vision's right in front of us and we're struggling to understand, we must draw nearer to Him. Don't draw to the other things that give pseudo answers, pseudo help. The tree in the middle of the garden was not meant to make them wise, as Satan would lead Adam and Eve to believe. That was a trap of pride. We must stay focused on God. And as we continue through and we dig deeper into this vision in the next parts, we can't live our lives fearful of what could be. We can't live our lives fearful of what God may be doing. But instead, we fix our eyes on him. We renew our minds in him. We seek his wisdom. We seek his understanding. We seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and then all these things will be added to you. Let that be your encouragement today. That when we look around and we see a world on fire, we can know that God is still in control and his will be done.